Hello and welcome to the Final Fantasy XIV Dark Knight Guide. This guide will cover the basics of the rotation, abilities, utility and mitigation of the Dark Knight job at level 90. A raid party in Final Fantasy consists of 2 tanks, 2 healers and 4 DPS. Dark Knight fills one of the tank spots in this party. It does so alongside Warrior, Gunbreaker and Paladin. Dark Knight specifically focuses on generating and pooling 2 resources, mana points and blood, which they can spend on large bursts of damage every 2 minutes. Before diving into the abilities and the rotation, I figured it would be good to talk about the job gauges first. The Dark Knight job gauge consists of 3 elements. The first is your grit indicator. Activating grit greatly increases the amount of enmity generated by attacks and abilities. The indicator is shown red when grit is active or black if it's not. The second gauge is your blood gauge. This fills up with blood as you use a few of your signature abilities. The third gauge is your dark side gauge. This gauge will display the remaining time of your dark side buff, a buff that increases your damage dealt by 10% and that must be maintained at all times using Edge of Shadow. This gauge will also display the remaining timer of your living shadow if active, and if you have dark art stored or not. Dark Knight has a fair few abilities to understand before we can properly dive into the rotation. So let's go over them together. Dark Knight has a 1-2-3 combo, referred to as the Soul Eater combo. It starts with Hard Slash, which is a low potency GCD. Next up is Siphon Strike, a GCD that if comboed will restore 600 mana points. And lastly you have Soul Eater. This is a GCD that does a fair amount of damage if comboed and will also heal you and increase your blood gauge by 20. Let's talk about abilities that spend that blood gauge. Living Shadow summons a shadow clone of yourself to attack the enemy. This is a highly potent ability which requires 50 blood gauge to use. This ability is also the highest priority usage of your blood gauge. Next is Blood Spiller. This is a simple high potency GCD that requires 50 blood gauge to use. The ability does not break your 1-2-3 combo and thus can be freely used without worrying about breaking your combo. Dark Knight's main rotational difficulty comes from management of your mana. So let's talk about different ways to generate and spend your mana. Alongside your 1-2-3 combo, you can generate mana points and blood gauge by using the following. Blood Weapon. This grants you 5 stacks of Blood Weapon. Each is spent when using a weapon skill or spell. When spent, they generate 10 blood and 600 mana each. Carve and Spit is a hard-hitting OGCD that generates 600 mana points when used. Delirium is an OGCD that grants you 3 stacks of Delirium. Each allows a free usage of Blood Spiller or Quietus, and additionally these Blood Spillers restore 200 mana points each, and Quietus restores 500 mana points each. These abilities, alongside your passive mana regen, is how you will be obtaining mana throughout the fight. Mana is mainly spent on Edge of Shadow, which is an OGCD that costs 3000 mana to use. Upon execution, this ability also grants you a 10% increased damage buff for the next 30 seconds. This buff can be stacked to a maximum of 60 seconds. The idea behind the Dark Knight rotation is that you want to pull as much mana into buff windows as possible because Edge of Shadow is a large chunk of your DPS. Alongside holding until you're close to overcapping, you can store 1 free use of Edge of Shadows with the Dark Arts buff, which comes from the Blackest Night. The Blackest Night costs the same amount of mana as an Edge of Shadow and puts a barrier on the target equal to 25% of their maximum HP. If the barrier is broken within the next 7 seconds, you gain a buff called Dark Arts. This buff lasts indefinitely and makes your next Edge of Shadow cost no mana to execute. This means you are essentially storing the cost of 1 Edge of Shadow into a buff, allowing you to use an additional Edge of Shadow under raid buffs. Do be careful, if the barrier does not get consumed after those 7 seconds, it will disappear and your mana will have been wasted. On top of this, we have a few more abilities. Salted Earth is an OGCD that places a stationary AoE underneath you that deals damage over time to any enemy standing within. After using Salted Earth, the ability turns into Salt and Darkness. Using this ability instantly deals a high amount of damage to all enemies inside of the puddle. Unmend is an instant cast spell that allows you to keep uptime outside of mana range. The spell also has increased enmity generation. Plunge is your gap closer. It does do a moderate amount of damage, so try to keep this for your rate buff windows without overcapping charges. Shadowbringer is a line AoE that does high damage to the first target hit and moderate damage to all others. It has a 60-second cooldown and can hold 2 stacks, meaning that you can effectively save them for the 2-minute buff windows without overcapping. On AoE encounters, you naturally have access to the AoE variants of your single target abilities. On 2 targets, use the 1-2 combo Unleash and Stalwart Soul instead of your 1-2-3 Soul Eater combo. Starting on 3 targets, you can use Quietus to spend your blood gauge and Flood of Shadows to spend your mana. Lastly, on 4 or more targets, you can start using Abyssal Drain instead of Carve and Spit. Dark Knight has a few different ways to start their encounters. They can decide on how they want to do that based on their kill time, their skill speed, and phase timings. That said, in this guide I will be covering only the standard opener. 5 seconds before the pull, use Blood Weapon. Then use TBN 2 seconds before the pull on the main tank. Start the pull with your 1-2-3 Soul Eater combo. Hard Slash, weave in Edge of Shadow and Delirium. Siphon the Strike and drink your tincture. Soul Eater and weave in Living Shadow and Salted Earth. Use another Hard Slash and weave in Shadowbringer and Edge of Shadow. Use 3 Blood Spillers and weave in order Carve and Split, Plunge, Shadowbringer, Edge of Shadow, Salt and Darkness, and another Edge of Shadow. Continue onto your 1-2-3 with Siphon Strike, weave in Plunge and another Edge of Shadow, and finish your opener with Soul Eater. Here's an example of the opener being done. After the opener, the rotation becomes more of a priority system, where you try to prevent overcapping mana, blood gauge or cooldowns, whilst trying to carry over as much resources into the 2 minutes rate buffs as possible. It is recommended to always save at least 3000 mana for usage on Blackest Night. Dark Knight naturally brings a large amount of mitigation and utility into the raid, as all tanks do. Let's talk about these abilities. Shadow Ball reduces all damage taken by 30%. Dark Mind reduces all magic damage taken by 20%. The Blackest Night provides a shield to yourself or a target party member equal to 25% of their max HP. If that shield is consumed fully, you are granted a buff called Dark Arts, which grants you 1 free usage of Edge of Shadow. Dark Missionary reduces all magic damage taken by the party by 10%. Oblation reduces the damage taken by yourself or a target party member by 10%. Grit is your tank stance. Enabling this greatly increases the enmity you generate. Living Dead is your tank invulnerability. If you take damage that would kill you while having the Living Dead buff, it is replaced with the Walking Dead debuff, which lasts 10 seconds and prevents your HP from being reduced below 1. Walking Dead makes your GCDs heal you. If you are healed for an amount of HP equal to your maximum HP minus 1, after Walking Dead is activated, it becomes Undead Rebirth. Keeping the same duration, Undead Rebirth also prevents your HP from being reduced below 1, but this does not have the healing effect of Walking Dead. If you are not healed for an amount of HP equal to your maximum HP minus 1 while Walking Dead is active, you will die at the end of the duration of this debuff. Alongside these abilities, Dark Knight also gains access to the tank roll actions. Rampart reduces all damage taken by 20%. Low Blow stuns your target. Provoke generates a high amount of enmity on your target. This is affected by Grit. Interject interrupts the target's cast. Reprisal applies a debuff to all nearby enemies, reducing their damage dealt by 10%. Arm's Length is your knockback immunity. This ability can double up as mitigation in dungeons, as enemies that hit you whilst this is active get reduced auto attack speed. Shirk sends 25% of your current enmity to a target. You can combine this with Provoke to tank swap quite easily. For ease of use, a lot of tanks use a macro to do this without targeting their off tank. It is worth noting that macros cannot be action queued, and thus you might have to spam press the button. There are a few things I wish to mention that didn't fit into any specific category, but I still believe are important to mention. If you have high ping, it might be difficult to prevent clipping GCDs or double weaving. This makes the job perform significantly worse. However, there are ways to deal with this. For PC users, you can use a no-clippy or FFXIV Alexander to increase the spell queue window. For both PC users and console users, you can use a VPN to get a better route to the server, possibly reducing your ping that way. For more information, check the Balance Discord. XIV Analysis is a useful tool that helps you analyze your rotation. Simply put in your FFLogs report to see what you can improve upon. I recommend using this frequently whilst learning the job. A special thanks to Tess and Twintails for providing footage for this guide, and the Balance Dark Knight staff for fact-checking and proofreading the content of the guide.